Okay, it's 2 minutes after. I think we might as well get started. And as folks come in, hopefully they'll be able to catch up. My name is Jesse Liberty. This is Advanced.NET MAUI. And this will be an interesting experiment. Some of this will be live. Some of this is already recorded. The parts that are recorded are the code walkthrough. And I do that because it makes it much easier to show you, highlight the various parts of the code, and make sure that we're looking at and talking about the same thing. What we're going to cover today is a wide range of advanced topics. You may, depending on whether you are an experienced Xamarin.Forms programmer, already know some about selecting data templates at runtime. We're going to talk about managing visual state, which has become more important in MAUI. We're going to look at a couple ways to validate your code. A big part of what we'll look at is the community toolkit, which has a wide range of features and a variety of triggers and behaviors already written for you. We'll look at the built-in user preferences. We'll spend a little time on the all-important topic of unit testing, and then, time allowing, we'll talk about consuming REST services. At the end of all of that, we'll do some Q&A and wrap up for the evening. Let me see if I can get this video started and make sure that you all can hear it. Okay, I'm being told you cannot hear any audio. And of course, I did set this up this morning to make sure that everything was going to work perfectly. So of course it's not. Let's see if I can quickly figure out how to get that audio to come through the system audio. Bear with me just a couple minutes. Can't be that hard. What you're looking at on screen is the application that we're going to look at how it was built. It's called Forget Me Not, and it's an application to help keep track of your friends and loved ones and what things they like so that you can easily buy presents for them. That's the premise, but this is not going to work if I can't figure out how to get the system sound working for you. I guess the worst case, I can put it through a speaker and put the mic by the speaker. Let's try that and see how that goes. Let me know in chat if this is audible and clear. I'm going to get that started in 1 second. Of course, it doesn't like that either. Just bear with me a moment. All right, let's try this. Why should it be easy when it can be difficult? All right, let's try. That is to say, preferences that are stored as in other applications for how you want this application to work. I'm going to say that the display name should be Jesse Liberty. We should use the light theme. Let's save that. And .NET MAUI is going to hold that for us. Now, if we go over to preferences, and I'm sorry about the duplicate naming here, we can see that the user has filled in many of these preferences. There's a prompt, which is read if the preference is empty, and the prompt itself can also be edited. So if I don't want to say pets here, I can say, for example, dog or anything else. And I'm going to fill in the name of my dog so that my potential buddy will know the name of my dog in case he wants to buy a present that has to do with Simon. Once I've made my changes, I can come down to the Save button, click Save, and I'm going to get a toast indicating that my preferences were saved. I can save at any time. Let's go over to the Buddies tab, take a quick look there. Here's where I find my buddies listed. If I click on one, I will get their details, and here I would see their preferences. I can also add a buddy using the built-in share mechanism for the operating system. I'll click Gmail, and I get a canned message ready to go. I'm going to address it using the built-in contacts. I'll choose a contact, and fill in a subject line. In this case, I'll put in join forget-me-not. Notice that the invitation itself is canned. You can edit that, and there'll be a magic URL to help you with logging in and establishing that connection. Let's go back to home and turn our attention to the code. The first place I want to go is to that preferences page where the user fills in their preferences and talk about how it works that one entry will be red and one black, depending on whether or not the actual value is there or is empty. So we're going to go to preferences page XAML. Let's make this bigger so it's a little easier to see. We'll set that to 150%. And we're going to notice that there's a data template called preferences template. We can collapse that and see there's a second data template called preference template empty. Let's look at the difference between these two templates. In the first template, preference template, we have an entry whose text color is black, although on iOS it's white. And then we have a second entry where you fill in the value. In the second data template called preference template empty, the entry is red, although on iOS it will be yellow, given that on platform. So how does it know which to show? The way we manage that is we come down here to services preference data template selector. We're going to go look at services and we name the two preferences. Preferences template points up to the preference template. Preference template empty points up to the static resource preference template empty. And it has a key preference data template selector. So we're going to look for that in the services folder. Sure enough, we have the right file, preferences data template selector. It has members of type data template, which are public properties, and correspond to what we have in the preference data template selector. In there is the logic on select template that says if the preference value is null or its length is under 0, we're going to use the preference template empty. But if its length is greater than 0, we'll use the regular preference template. How does it know how to call on select template? Let's come back to the preferences page and scroll down to the collection view. You can see that the collection view's item template is the preference data template selector, and its item source is the preference list. So as it iterates through the preference list with each item, it's going to get its template from that preference data template selector, which has the logic for choosing which data template to show. This way you can have 2, 3, as many data templates as you want, and with each item display them based on whatever criteria you set. Let's go up and look at the resource dictionary, and we've got another very interesting style for the button. Here it says visual state group list. Visual states correspond to the state of whatever object you're looking at, in this case the button, and there is something called the normal states, which is focused, disabled, and normal. So here we're saying for visual state normal, we want the background color to be light green. For focused, we want it to be green, and for disabled, we want it to be gray. When we come down to that button, we see that there's a data trigger. That data trigger references the password entry field, and it sets the value equals 0. So that's the condition that will fire the data trigger. And what it's going to do when it fires, we see in the setter, which says the property is enabled and the value is false. That is, it's disabled if the password entry is empty. And we can see that is disabled until we're going to get to filling in the password. So let's first fill in the email. And we're going to get to why that's red and changes in just a moment. Notice that submit is empty until I enter one letter for the password, and now the condition has changed to light up that button. When we have the focus, it turns dark green, and when we click it, it does the login. We're going to be using the Community Toolkit, as we talked about in the earlier presentation. The Community Toolkit has a lot to offer. In addition to the auto generation that we saw, there's a huge list of behaviors that have been written for you and tested. These include behaviors for animation, for validating email, the very important event to command behavior that helps with taking an event and allows you to handle it back in the view model. There's a whole lot here. We're going to be looking at a couple of them, but we have animation behaviors, status bar behaviors, text validation behaviors. We also have a number of views available to us. The one we're particularly interested this time is going to be the expander. That's how we do the expanding on the About page. It tells you what the view is and how to add it to your application, including sample code. So here we have the About page. We've installed the expander, and you can see by clicking on credits, it expands, and by clicking on it again, it disappears. Another important behavior is the email validation behavior. Notice the flag is set to validate on value changed. So each time the value changes in that entry, it will check to see if it's a valid email. And that checking for valid email is done for you by the behavior. You can also set up a style for when it's valid. If we come back to the documentation, click on behaviors and email validation behavior, we see that it tells us the syntax and how to lay this out in the XAML. So let's go back to our code where we're going to be able to run that using the entries behaviors collection. One of the things that we'll be able to do is to look at when the user has stopped typing. That's another behavior that's available from the Community Toolkit. You tell it what command you want called, when the user stops typing, and what the time threshold is. Here I put 500 or half a second. That's 500 milliseconds or half a second. When the user stops typing, the validate name command will be called. In the entry below that, you can see the same thing, but the validate email command will be called. And below that, we have the password doing the same thing. User stop typing, we're going to call validate password command. Let's look at those commands. They're in the view model. Here's the create account view model that we have set up with those commands. These are relay commands, as you would expect. Here I have actually manually used a regex for whether the email is valid or not. For validate name, we're simply looking to see if it's null or empty and whether the length is greater than or equal to 2. So we don't consider a 1-character name as valid, but anything from 2 characters on is valid. Notice that the enable button says that it has to be, in order to be enabled, it has to have a valid name, and it has to have a valid email and a valid password. Here we're checking the validate email, and we're setting the error message if it's not valid. And similarly on the password, we show the password error message if it is not valid. So let's go up to the create and go into that page. We'll enter a name. Stop typing. Seems fine because remember that anything over 1 character will do. Let's go to the email. Stop typing. And now we have an invalid email. So we'll continue on until we have a valid email and the red prompt goes away. Similarly with the password, If I type just one letter, it says it must be at least 6 characters, and that is again because it's checking that the user has stopped typing. Once we have all of those set up, we can click sign up. It's going to fail because jesseliberty@gmail.com is already in the database. Let's change that to jesseliberty50, sign up, and create a new account, and we get that alert box that says it's been created successfully. Back at the home page, we're now logged in as jesseliberty50. Let's close that down and take a look at another way of approaching validation. We're going to come down to the user preferences page where the user can enter their preferences for the application. This is built into .NET MAUI. We have a user preference view model with 3 properties: display name, theme selection, and Wi-Fi only. And we have a relay command for saving the preferences. We also have a constructor for getting the preferences. We use preferences default get. You can see that's static. And that has 2 values: the value that was stored in display name or the default value to use, in this case, unknown. We come back to the XAML, and we can see that the user is prompted to enter the display name. However, on the horizontal stack layout, notice that there's a radio button group whose group name is theme group name. There, we can have the selected value bind to the theme selection, and we've got 2 radio groups, one with the selected value, one with the name, and inside that we've got the 2 radio buttons that will be mutually exclusive, dark and light. Managing the storage of these values and retrieving them is entirely handled by .NET MAUI. You can see once again that you can save preferences using the static method set, and you pass in the key and the value, and in the constructor you use get, and you pull out based on the key the value that's there, and if there's no value, the default value comes out. Let's talk about unit testing. Why do we do unit testing? The key reason for me is that when I refactor my code, I need to make sure I haven't broken anything else. A secondary reason is that unit testing acts as self-documentation for the code. The nature of a good unit test is that it's fast, isolated, repeatable, self-verifying, and timely. Let's talk about what those mean. Well, if it's not fast, the user is simply not going to use it because it'll be in the way of development. Good unit tests are isolated. They don't have a dependency on one another, and the order of the test doesn't matter. And they're repeatably reliable. That is, every time you run it, you get the same result. This can fail by not cleaning up data or by using non-deterministic code due to threading. That's FIR. The S is self-verifying. That is, we get unambiguous results. We assert just one thing, and we know exactly what it means when that fails. And they're timely. They must be run after every change, whether you're using TDD, that is test-driven development, or test after development. Writing the test, we typically use the AAA formula: arrange your code, act on it, and then assert the result that you expect. If you're going to use testing with .NET MAUI, you need to make a change to the CS project. You need to add .NET 7, and then you need to have a condition on the output type that says if the framework is not .NET 7, create an exe. And that allows your .NET 7 unit test to be a DLL rather than an exe, which is what you want. This code will be available with the slides. Let's return to our code and look under tests at the NuGet packages that we're going to need. I've already installed mine. You'll find yours under browse, And the first one that we care about is the XUnit NuGet package, because we'll be using XUnit for our testing. XUnit is very much like NUnit, just a little bit newer, has some nice features to it. And then we're going to use mocking, which I'll explain as we go. There are a number of good mocking frameworks out there. The one we're going to use is NSubstitute because I find it easy to work with and very efficient. So we'll add NSubstitute to the project as well. Mocks are a critical part of unit testing. If you're going to test a part of your code that goes out to the disk or over the network and it's going to take a long time, you use a mock, which is going to come back instantly with predictable results. Let's come down to my unit tests, and the very first unit test I always write is must be true. And in that, I assert that it's true that the value true is true. That is to say, this test must pass. I can test that by going up to the test menu choice and choosing the Test Explorer. That's going to open up my Test Explorer window. In order to run my test, it's going to have to build the application. Inside the test, you see that we have the ability to drill down to the specific test that we care about. In my case here, it's going to be the must be true. We're going to click Run, which is going to run that test after it's built. Through the magic of video, I'm going to save you the time of watching this build ever so slowly. And it comes back and tells me that the test has been run and that it has succeeded with the green arrow. Next, we're going to look at a test called After Calling init, your preferences are not empty. To do this, we're going to create a preference object, and then we're going to create a list of preferences with the two preference objects I'll create. Now, rather than going out to the network and saying get preferences, I'm going to create a mock using substitute for the iPreference service and tell it that it's going to call get preferences, and when it does, it's going to return that collection I just created. We'll then create a preferences view model and pass in that substitute to the view model. Let's go to the view model. Here we see the preferences list, and we see the constructor is passing in an interface. Remember, it must be an interface so that we can pass in that mock. We set the service to whatever service we passed in, and in the init, we set the preferences list to calling get preferences, and you'll remember that the substitute is going to pass in our predetermined list, and we're going to be able to assert that it got that list. On the next one, we're going to make sure that if it's empty, we don't get an exception. So in a range, we're going to set the preferences to a new list with nothing in it. On the mock, we're going to return that empty list. We're going to call preferences view models constructor, passing in our mock, and we're going to check to see whether we got an exception, and we're going to assert that we did not get an exception by calling assert.null and passing in the exception that we got back from the test. On my third test, I'm going to say that if the preferences collection is not empty but is null, I still don't want to get an exception. So I'm going to use a nullable list of preferences, which I'll set to null. I'll set up my mock to return that null set of preferences. I will again pass that into the preferences view model. And again, I'm going to check to see whether I get an exception when I call the init method on the view model. And I'm asserting that I will not get an exception, just as I did in the one above. Let's run all of the tests by pressing the leftmost button. It's going to build again, and there we go. All of the tests pass. That tells me that the preferences view model is safe when using the preferences, whether there's anything in them or not, or even if they're null. Let's switch subjects to consuming REST services. REST has a complex definition, but the simplest part of it is that we're going to interact with the host using HTTP commands. We'll take a look at the domain objects, the DTOs, and most important, the client that we'll use to interact with the API. For this to work, we're going to add new projects to our solution, one for the domain, one for the DTOs, and the important one, which is the API client. The first two of those are class libraries, and the third will be a web API, and we're going to position that on Azure. We'll need a few more model classes to flesh this out. Remember, the user can send an invitation to other potential buddies. The idea of an occasion is I want to know where I'm going to buy a present, for example, an upcoming anniversary. We'll need a user and a buddy object. We find all of these in the model folder. And here we see, if you can squint, that we have objects for each of those. Let's go to the buddy object. The buddy object has a number of nullable properties, including the mailing address, the website, their address on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, and so forth. We also have a date time, which is how long we've been buddies. The invitation has only two properties, the buddy code that was passed in through the share, and the ID, which will be unique for this buddy. The occasion, as we discussed, will have the name of the occasion, what's the date of the occasion, so for example, February 12th, and how many days in advance do you want to be notified that that occasion is coming up. In the model, we'll also have a user object. The user will have a name and ID. It'll have a list of buddies. It'll have a list of invitations, and it will have its preferences list. Let's switch over and look at the buddy DTO. This is the data transfer object that we'll use for transferring the buddy information to the server. We set the user ID, full name, and email on the buddy DTO. We get the list of preferences, and if there are any, we set the preferences on the DTO, and we set the occasions from the user. We give a user ID a GUID to guarantee it as a unique ID, and we set properties for the full name, email, preferences, and the list of occasions for this buddy. We also have, most importantly, that list of user preferences that the buddy has, in fact, that every user has. Let's look at the occasion DTO. This one's pretty simple. We set the ID, the occasion name, what's the date for the occasion. You'll notice this copies or maps very cleanly to the model. Once again, we have a unique ID as a GUID. The invite creation request simply needs the user name and the message that we're going to send to that user. Sending the unique URL is taken care of by the server. We get back a response from the user, which has, again, that unique ID and the information that we need for that user, email, and especially role. Is this an administrator or just a buddy? And we get back the preliminary list of user preferences as part of that user response. For occasions, we're going to have a data transfer object that has the information for the occasion. So again, we're going to model this on the model class. So we have the occasion name, the date of the occasion, the number of days to notify. This follows very cleanly from the model into the DTO. We have a login request for when the user wishes to log into the system. And remember that our login simply consists of a username and password. And so we're going to authenticate based on the username and an encrypted password. We can update the profile for that username by updating the list of the user preferences. And we have a profile response as part of our set of DTOs. And that's going to include the user's email and full name, whether the email has been confirmed, and what this user's role is. Once again, it includes a list of user preferences. The most important class in all of this is the API client. This is the part that our code will interact with. Notice on line 26 that it's a REST client. That's because we're using a library called REST Sharp that has a REST client to handle all of our interaction over the wire to our server. The client's constructor takes a base URL, and then it calls setClient. SetClient is going to set the base URL and a couple properties, whether it should throw an error and how long it should wait for a timeout. Once again, in milliseconds, so this is not going to time out until 10 seconds. And now we're going to set the local client member to be a new REST client. We pass in those options. For login, you'll remember we have the username and the password, and with that in place, we're ready to call authenticate. Notice the line above has is authenticated, and that's set depending on what happens with authenticate. Here we begin authenticate. We create a new REST request, and we pass into the body of that request the username and password, because that's what we use to authenticate. We get back an access token, and with that access token, we are able to do our OAuth authorization, passing in the access token and the base URL. Let's come down and look at a couple other utilities in the client. One is to get the version, which we do with a REST request, and we call on the client getAsync with that request object that we just created. We can get through the client the profile, and we can update that profile through the client. So notice that every interaction that we're having with the data on the server is through that client. Similarly, we can call getBuddy and get back through the REST request information about our buddy using a buddy DTO. We'll get a list of those. We can call create invitation and get back a GUID, and we can call get user list, which will give us back a list of user response objects. The interaction of building this looks more complex than it is because of that client class making life a whole lot easier. Let's take a quick look at the do login. We create a new login request. We set the show activity indicator to true, which makes our activity indicator spin, and we call login. Here's our login request object, which has the username and password. Coming back to do login, we're going to wait for the account service to call login, turn off the show activity indicator. If the account service is logged in, then we're going to go to the main page. In the login view model constructor, we're passing in an account service. If we go to account service, we see that it implements iAccount service. It has a client called API client, which is passed into the constructor. And this is how we can do our login using that API client. Rodrigo made my life a lot easier by providing me that client so that my interactions with the database and the server are all mediated by that client. As for the constructor injection, that is handled by .NET MAUI's built-in inversion of control container. So data injection becomes a simple task in .NET MAUI. The API itself is running on Azure. This address will be on the slides, which we will be putting on GitHub. It may or may not be up and running. I'm hoping that my account will handle it as the book sales go up. And I want to point out that we're using REST Sharp, which you can get at restsharp.dev. To find out more, I recommend the Microsoft documentation, which keeps getting better and better. I have a number of blog posts on my site, jesseliberty.com, and I have a number of very important podcasts with members from Microsoft. Let's talk about some questions. Don't see any questions in the Q&A. I'm hoping that that's because you found this crystal clear as opposed to so confusing that you can't even think of a question. We have a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Well, not seeing any, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come and see this. If you want to see it again or want more information, I've made this available now, very recently, on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com/Jesse Liberty, you can watch this again, and you can also see the links to where the code is and where the slides are. So thanks very much. I hope that you found this helpful, and I look forward to talking with you in the future.